Thank you, Council.
Thank you, Chair. At this afternoon's resumed hearing, I call Mr Damien Griffiths to give evidence before the Commission.
Thank you, Council. Welcome, Damien. Thank you.
Damien, is it okay if I call you Damien
Sure.
for the purpose of your evidence? Damien, do you undertake to provide truthful evidence to the Yoorrook Justice Commission today?
I do.
Thank you. Damien, could you please introduce yourself personally and culturally to the Commissioners?
Sure. My name is Damien Griffiths. I'm the CEO of the First Peoples Disability Network Australia. So we're a national organisation representing First Nations people with disability and their families. And I've been in that role since we began in about the year 2000. I'm a descendant of the Worimi people of the Wallamba Valley in New South Wales. So that's about 3 hours north of Sydney, around Foster, Cranback, Nabiac, that part of New South Wales. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you.
And how long have you been CEO of the First Peoples Disability Network?
Since about the year 2000, so we originally began as the Aboriginal Disability Network New South Wales before becoming a national body around 2010. So I've been involved since the very beginning. I was lucky enough to establish the organisation with Uncle Lester Bostock, who I'm sure you would know, proud Bundjalung man with physical disability. We established the New South Wales Network back in the year 2000, and then we evolved into a national body around 2010.
And so 22 years in that role, it's clear that you're passionate about issues relating to First Nations people with disabilities. Why are you so personally passionate about those issues?
Yeah, I grew up around a profoundly hearing impaired grandmother, so watching her life and the isolation she experienced as a person who was profoundly hearing impaired certainly inspired me to try and be a voice for mob with disability, really. But I've also had my own personal experiences, like many of us do, with mental health, and I'm lucky enough that I can get good support for that because I can afford to do it. But a lot of our mob can't, obviously, so they're the personal insights I've had.
And what are some of the key activities that the network engages in?
Yeah, so we do several things. We do a lot of advocacy work, particularly systemic advocacy and policy work, so making representations to government and non-government agencies, being a voice for mob with disability. We also do increasing amount of training where we try and educate and inform our own community members about their rights and entitlements from a disability perspective. That's still not well understood in our communities in many ways. But we also do a lot of community engagement work. So we try and spend as much time as we can out in community, hearing from people themselves about their situation so we can try and help them out. So essentially an advocacy organisation, not a direct service provider, but more a representative body advocacy organisation.
And in that advocacy, you've been involved in a number of important policy work and provided submissions to various government or judicial agencies, including a submission to the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability, and your organisation and you appeared before that Royal Commission to give evidence. You've also put together a statement dated the 2nd of March 2023, which attaches a number of things relevant to the Disability Royal Commission. Why was it important for there to be a First Nations voice at the Disability Royal Commission in terms of your submission and giving evidence before that commission?
Yeah, sure. So we often say at the First Peoples Disability Network, it's difficult to think of any more disadvantaged Australians than First Nations people with disability, often because of the discrimination they face based upon indigeneity and ableism or disability. And we all have family members with disability. It's very unusual for us not to. We have very high rates or high prevalence of disability. And a lot of our people with disability are without a voice in the mainstream society. So what we often see is that within the community itself, our people with disability are well supported, valued members of their own communities, but when they engage with external systems, education, health services, that's when discrimination really begins. So we were really anxious to ensure that we had a strong presence at the Royal Commission. Commissioner Andrea Mason was appointed as the Indigenous Commissioner at the Disability Royal Commission, which was a very positive development. She established an advisory council structure, and that was really well attended. But in the sense that from a social justice perspective, we would say meeting the needs of our people with disability or speaking up for the needs of our people with disability has to be one of the most urgent social justice issues in Australia today, we would say.
And you mentioned your organisation started in New South Wales, but eventually grew to a national level. I assume that means that you've done work with and have connections to the Victorian Aboriginal community?
Yes, we do, and we've done a number of community engagement activities around the state. Unfortunately, the last couple of years with COVID's made that harder. But we do have strong connections, particularly in the Grampians. We sort of partner with the Grampians Disability Advocacy Service and BADAC in Ballarat. And we have spent time getting around the community. One of probably the frustrations, I think, the observations we would make is that there's been attempts for a long time now by mob with disability from here to try and grow their own state-based network. Unfortunately, the department has been reluctant to support that in the way that we think it should. We would say there's an urgent need to have a well-resourced formal network of Aboriginal people with disability from Victoria. You have some very prominent leaders down here. Uncle John Baxter is a great example. Other prominent leaders with disability from down here. But I think they're anxious to see a formal structure. And I think that it's long past time that happens. We'd be very happy to assist in any way. But we do have activity down here. We do have staff located in Victoria. We have 3 staff down here.
And I should say, Chair, I'll tender this, the statement of Damien Griffiths and the 3 annexures to that statement as well.
Will be entered into the record with the next exhibit numbers. Thank you.
Thank you. In your statement, you describe the unique First Nations way about thinking about disability and about communicating about disability. Could you just explain that to the commissioners?
Sure. So we're the thought leaders on inclusion. So as we know, and evidence shows, in traditional language, there's no comparable word to disability. And that's a wonderful thing. So we tend to take people come as you are. So the way we describe disability in our communities is entirely appropriate. It's impairment-based. So it might be brother can't move around too well, cousin's a bit slower than everyone else, uncle doesn't hear too well. Not said in a negative way, but more about that's what we need to think about so this person can participate in community. So we would say we're thought leaders on inclusion. And in fact, some research shows that our own community members with disability feel that they are valued and supported members in their own communities. It's the problem when you go beyond your community and start engaging with external systems, discrimination comes into it. So we would say that we have a lot to share with the wider disability rights movement about appropriate ways of talking about disability. And it's funny when you talk to most Australians with disability and you share that story, that's what they want, is not to be labelled. But perversely, we're in a heavily label-laden world. So to get access to the National Disability Insurance Scheme, you have to go and get a label, or you have to talk yourself down, really, to be able to get support. So the other thing that's been a really, I think is proof of this, is at Lake Mungo, very significant archaeological site, as we know, there's been a recent discovery of a single male footprint And the archaeologists there have theorised that it's a male person, one-legged male person who's using a stick. And the theory is they may even be moving at pace, participating in a hunt is the theory. But that shows that disability's always been an accepted part of the human experience from our perspective. And even more than that, we actually made accommodations or adaptations so that people could participate. There's further evidence of that now with sign languages, versions of sign language that have been in existence for a long time. And as a lot of us, as we all know, it's not uncommon for a blind person to be a traditional healer, for example. It's quite common. Or any range of other things, or songman or whatever it might be. So there's some really strong evidence to show that we've always understood disability to be part of the human experience, and that we're the thought leaders on inclusion.
And I suppose from that you could take that a number of systems in Australia and in Victoria could learn from that ancient practice of inclusion in order to better their own systems for all people, not only First Nations people. Would that be right? Absolutely.
We want to see more of that, more respect shown of our traditional knowledges around disability. We had a way of supporting our community members with disability, and still do, that is basically based on a common humanity. Unfortunately, we live in a world, and when the colonisers, the invaders came, they brought with them their approach to disability, and their approach to disability was institutionalisation. So we're still seeing those realities play out today. So it wasn't long, in Sydney, for example, very quickly institutions were built, and they were, for the term of the day was idiot houses and places like that. So, and even the prisons, you could imagine, were probably full of people that, in today's context, were probably people with cognitive impairment or psychosocial disability. So that approach was in conflict with our approach to disability, which is come as you are, and everyone has a role to play. So,
and the focus of the current hearings of the Yoorrook Justice Commission focus on the child protection and criminal justice systems, and I want to ask some questions about that shortly. But I know that the intersection between disability, First Nations identity, Aboriginality, and a variety of sectors would play out in different ways. But before turning to the child protection and criminal justice systems, you mentioned just now institutionalisation and that history of institutionalisation that was brought over to Australia. You mention some of those issues playing out in your statement. What's your knowledge about the history of institutionalisation of Aboriginal people with disabilities in Victoria?
Yeah, I think, so just to take that point further, yes, when the English came, they quickly built institutions. Melbourne, regional Victoria, significant parts of New South Wales had very notorious institutions built very early on. If I take the New South Wales experience, I'm thinking of Gladesville Hospital, Peat Island. Victoria had the Kew Institution. There was another, I think, out perhaps near Ballarat. But all of them were designed so that people were separate from the rest of society. So I give the New South Wales experience just for clarity for the Commission, but they were often built on top of the hills or by rivers, so people couldn't escape. The number of Aboriginal people that were placed in those institutions is unknown. There are, even within my own family history, I'm aware of family members who ended up, again, I'm referencing a New South Wales institution, but Stockton Hospital, which was a notorious institution, and they in fact died there. That wasn't uncommon. So we're talking about very secretive places where there were odd practices. People often slept in dormitories. their life was highly regulated. They were out of mind, out of sight. So back in the day, parents were often told, there's no hope for your child. This would often happen at the hospital and the child would be removed. There's no doubt that happened to Aboriginal families. How many Aboriginal families that impacted on, I don't think we really know, to be honest. There's also extraordinary revelations in some institutions of unmarked graves, for example. So you're talking about a highly secretive, out of mind, out of sight sort of experience. But there's no doubt there would be families here in Victoria that have been impacted by that. How many? I don't know. How many Aboriginal people died in these institutions? I don't think we really know that either. But we have members of our organisation who grew up in institutions, some of the institutions. One of our former board members grew up in an institution down here in Victoria. And she was denied her culture. She didn't know of her Aboriginality. It's inconceivable that the institution would have even contemplated that, to be honest. So her story is a very typical one. So some Aboriginal people with disability talk about themselves as a lost generation. So not a stolen, well, they're stolen, but they also talk about how their stories aren't told. And I think that's something we need to understand better. But there's a lack of data, a lack of research, probably even a lack of acknowledgement by these institutions that these practices happened, but they were notorious places, highly secretive and extraordinary violations of people's rights, really.
And you mentioned in your statement that you know of some institutions in Victoria, such as those at Colac, Bendigo and Oakley. Are those the types of institutions you're talking
absolutely notorious. They're often referred to as, they often had a mental health sort of label to them, so psychiatric institutions. Some of them kept language from long ago, which were offensive in today's terms. But the reality in each and every one of them is that there was practices that were essentially about denying people's liberty, people congregating in dormitory-style accommodation. People were very vulnerable to abuse by the people that worked there or even by people they lived with. There's been inquiries about these institutions, but it's still an issue that is largely out of mind, out of sight, I would say.
Turning to some of your evidence in your statement about the experience of First Nations peoples with disabilities in child protection, you highlight that there's really two potential engagements in the system. One, because First Nations parents themselves might have a disability, and then there might be engagement where a First Nations child has a disability. Just taking first, and there might obviously be crossover between those things where you've got both parents and children with disabilities. But just taking the circumstances of a parent with a disability, in your experience, how do First Nations parents with disabilities often come to engage with the child protection system?
Yeah, so they're often judged by the system as bad parents. So, and that's ableism. So we are certainly aware amongst our membership of First Nations parents with disability who are almost flagged by the system, that the system more or less identifies them as someone to keep an eye on, and then they're far more likely to have their child removed based upon the disability aspect of their life. The view that the system would say, because you have a cognitive impairment, because you have physical disability, you can't parent. There's never any evidence to show that. There's always perhaps an opportunity to perhaps learn some skills to perhaps better parent, perhaps in some instances, but it's often a rush to judgment that because a parent has disability, they are not capable of being a parent. That's a common experience that we find amongst our membership. And it could be sometimes on some occasions where the parent may need some extra support to parent. It may be that they may have a physical disability that requires some adaptations in their house, for example, but it's never a question of whether that person is a loving parent, in my experience. It's always about the rush to judgment because they have a disability they can't parent. And we have incidences of that amongst our membership where that's a common story. And also that, I guess it's a form of, the only way I can explain it in my own mind is it's a form of racial profiling that has the ableism element to it, if you get my drift. So it's almost like an ableism profiling that the system will put in place. So if you're a parent with a cognitive impairment and you're in the hospital system, it's probably likely someone's going to informally probably make a note of that, and likely to end up being surveillance on you as a parent.
And you hinted at it in your answer, but I presume a lot of what you've said goes for all parents with disabilities in terms of potential engagement with the child protection system. Does that play out uniquely for Aboriginal parents?
No, I wouldn't say it's unique to Aboriginal parents with disability, but you can be assured that they've got two profiling elements there, if you get my drift. So the Aboriginality and the disability makes it far more likely that you're going to be surveillance will be upon you. It's a common experience for any Australian with disability who's a parent, but with the added extra element of Aboriginality, then you can be sure surveillance is coming your way, I would think.
Turning then to the situation where a child or children might have a disability, again, the same question. In your experience, what issues do you see arising, particularly for Aboriginal families where children might have a disability in terms of their engagement with the child protection system?
Yes, again, the system rushing to judgment, and the system not understanding the context. So I'm aware of families down here in Victoria, including in Victoria, where, say, a caseworker may present at a house, check the fridge, there's no food in the fridge. There's no food in the fridge because there's poverty. It's not neglect. It's the reality of living in poverty. And then the system immediately jumps to these various conclusions and the child is removed. The system often doesn't understand that having disability is inherently expensive. It's expensive to have a disability. You often need extra supports that are more costly. So if you have a child with physical disability, say, significant physical disability, there could be all sorts of added costs that there could be anything from incontinence pads to getting the right wheelchair to having access to meaningful painkillers or whatever it might be. These are all added expenses that aren't easily managed. And the system doesn't understand that well. So that rush to judgment is an inherent problem in the system, and a lack of understanding of what is required when supporting a family member with disability. It requires extra funds. It requires access to different things altogether than what many families need. And I think we have a workforce in the out-of-home care system that doesn't understand those dynamics. I almost could say that almost universally, I hate to say. That's definitely a reality. The system's lack of understanding and the lack of understanding of what's required in providing support to a family member with disability.
And if poverty is a key driver, and as we know, poverty affects Aboriginal families more often than non-Aboriginal families, does that particularly exacerbate the problem for Aboriginal families who might have children with disabilities? No question.
No question. So, there's so many stories we deal with in my organisation. Things like the difficulty in getting to school. So if you have a young person with significant disability in your family, in the school 3-4 k's away, and you have no means of accessing transport. So let's take the example, and these are all too common in our experience, where a young First Nations child with disability has significant physical disability, maybe a wheelchair user. If there's no means to get to the school, so we're aware of situations where young children are pushed 2 or 3 kilometres to the nearest school by another family member, or you go to a school that can't accommodate your disability, common experience, more common in regional remote parts of Australia, but would happen in regional Victoria. If you're in a town where there's only one school and that school can't accommodate the child's disability, well, the child doesn't go to school. So then the system would assume that you're failing as a parent because your child isn't, computer says this many absences, when the reality is you've had to push your child for 3 kilometres to go to school. So again, it's this lack of understanding of how poverty plays out. I'm not aware of too many Aboriginal families across the country that have access to a wheelchair accessible vehicle, certainly not a private one. Again, that's another example of not understanding the costs associated with disability. So to get access to a wheelchair accessible vehicle in Australia, you have to pay more money. You have to go get either a standard vehicle modified or there's a few vehicles out there on the market, but they're often 20-30% more than a... So again, these things are not well understood. And again, the system will, I'm assuming, operate, say, off a computer and sort of say there's been 30 absences and parents are failing. Well, no, it's the reality that the community can't accommodate the child's disability, or the education system doesn't accommodate the child's disability. That's quite a common story,
Is the National Disability Insurance Scheme helping?
The National Disability Insurance Scheme has failed our mob with disability. One thing I can report on, which is a positive development starting from tomorrow, is we are co-chairing a First Nations strategic refresh in co-chairing with the CEO of the NDIA, so there has been some reform, but the NDIS has failed our mob with disability and needs to start over, frankly. One of the big challenges there is that it takes a deficit approach, So to get access to the scheme, you've got to talk yourself down. So you're more likely to get access if you say how bad your life is. So that is in complete conflict with our worldview that everyone has a role and everyone has a place. So no, the NDIS needs to do much, much better. It's failed to date.
Just before we leave the child protection system and discuss the criminal justice system, you mention in paragraph 13 of your statement that there is no reliable data about First Nations people with disability in out-of-home care, and you are not aware of any data that shows how many Aboriginal children with disability are in out-of-home care anywhere in the country. Do you think that data should be collected, and if so, why is it important?
Yeah, I do think that data should be collected. I'm happy to be proven wrong on that statement, but I believe that to be absolutely true, that we don't know of how many Aboriginal children with disability in out-of-home care anywhere. Yes, we absolutely need to collect that data. To the anecdotal feeling that we have at the First Peoples Disability Network is that number will be very high. It'll be disproportionately higher than the rest of the Australian population, so we need to establish that. When I speak of data, I get nervous though, because we have to do it the right way. It's got to be collected by our people, not by a system where we're going to cause harm to people. So many of our families are very reluctant to speak to authorities about disability, for good reason. Again, amongst our membership, a common thing parents will say to us is we don't tell anyone that we have a child with disability because, one, if we do, every chance our child will be removed, or we know someone down the road that that's happened to. Also, why would you take on another perceived negative label if you're already experiencing discrimination based on your indigeneity? So it's very, very loaded. So it's got to be done by us because that's the only way it could be done safely. The worst thing I could imagine, and I sometimes worry that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a good example. Some of the ways that that's assessed is through things like facial features, size of the head. Jeepers, I'd be nervous about, where I'm getting to here is if we went down some weird and wonderful eugenics thing where we start doing that sort of stuff, that'd be the real worry. So we need to go and collect that data and do it in the way that we know how.
So, Councillor, could I just
Yes,
ask on
of
that?
course.
With going to get some form of assessment to get a diagnosis, we've heard previously, and this isn't within the disability space, that they generally don't want to go to the doctors just in case of removal for Aboriginal families.
Absolutely.
What would your responsibility to that for disability?
So that happens in Disability, Commissioner, no doubt. So we need to be running the systems that get our mob into the NDIS, is a good example. So we need to be able to having the safe conversations where we can talk in a way that, because a lot of our families won't disclose what they need. They'll go, or the other one that we hear about a lot is, oh, don't worry about it, we'll manage, because the fear that if they engage the system, the risks are so high, why on earth would you do it? The assessment system, as you know, is not culturally appropriate at all.
My next question for you.
It's just, it's ridiculous. So, there's some interesting theories around things like cognitive impairment and IQ tests, for example. So, it depends on the context, doesn't it? So a young person may be able to move around country very, very effectively and very safely, but they might do a IQ test written in English and the result might be of a particular result, whereas you could argue, no, that young person has extraordinary cultural knowledge, and in the context of where they live, there's no intellectual impairment there. You know what I mean? So there's some interesting dynamics there. We also need to develop our own assessment tools because we do need to get access to the NDIS, no question, but the way it's set up at the moment is completely... there are some families that have got results out of it, but and that's great, that's wonderful, but that's the exception. It's not, it's only because they know how to work the system and, know how to say the right things, but to get support in that area. But the reality is, and then you've got the situation of assessments. That in itself is so loaded, eh? So hang on a minute, you're assessing my child, you're making judgments about my child. Often the assessments, if I keep using the NDIS as an example, are done in short periods, 30-minute interviews, 1-hour interviews, no real context, no poverty context, and a real lack of understanding of what people's lives are really like. So, and then the cost associated with getting assessments. So I think FASD is still around $9,000 to get an assessment. So
would you say there's not that we want diagnosis, but you would say there was in out-of-home care, would there be an underdiagnosis of some of our children's needs? I
would be absolutely floored if that wasn't the case, Commissioner. I think it would have to, and this is why we need the data. So we've got, there's a lot of anecdotal data in this area, but not enough of really robust, proper data. But my fear would be how that's collected,
I just asked that, so if first people should be collecting the data and designing the measurements and all the other things that go along with this.
Yes.
But whose responsibility is it, do you think, to actually support this or pay for this?
So the national
appropriate data collection.
So the National Disability through the data collection.
Yeah.
I'm not a data collection person, but I guess you've got your ABSs and your Institute of Health and Welfare and things. Is that what you mean? Or?
No. I mean, whose responsibility is to make sure that these data are collected? The fact they're not being collected now means that the powers that be that pay for these things don't regard it as important to know,
Yeah,
because we always collect lots of data on the things we think are important to know about Aboriginal people, like
yes.
how poor we are, how unhealthy we are. But this does not seem to be important to know. Is that NIAA that has some
Yeah,
ownership here?
Commissioner, I think therein lies the problem, is who is responsible. So NIAA would be a logical, but then I would think state and territory governments have a critical role to play because they're more likely to have closer access to the families potentially. So DHHS, I would assume, needs to collect this data. The thing that I would want to be sure of is how it's done, you know. That's the most critical thing, I think.
Who's in charge? Who's deciding what it is important to know, how
Yep.
to measure it, and how it's reported and interpreted?
Absolutely. So you'd need to establish some sort of working group to get the questions right to begin with. So you wouldn't go in and say, do you have a disability? But that's what's happened in the past. It's more around, do you have a family? But you've got to have trust, though. So there's got to be people, and the best people to do this research, we would argue, is probably First Nations people with disability themselves. So them going out in the community and say, this is my story. You know, we want to have a yarn about disability, or we want to talk about who has trouble moving around their community, or who has trouble getting to school, or it doesn't even need to be framed necessarily as a disability thing. It's more an impairment way of describing it. So I think that's one of the problems, Commissioner, is someone needs to take ownership of it and leadership of it, and I think that therein lies one of the problems, actually.
Can I ask a question, if I may? You've referred to mental ill health in the disability context. Firstly, is there a cultural way of describing that from a functional point of view?
Yeah, I'd probably refer to colleagues who've got a lot more expertise than me in that area, but people like Pat Dudgeon, Helen Milroy, well-known Aboriginal psychologists, but often from Western Australia, who've done a lot of work on building cultural assessment tools. I think it'd be really helpful, if I may, for the Commissioner to talk to experts in that area. But the one thing I would say is we would say at the First Peoples Disability Network, it's pretty exceptional as a First Nations person if you haven't experienced psychosocial disability or mental health of some kind. So anxiety, depression, PTSD, almost normalised in some of our communities. So when we have disability data in Australia now, so in our communities it says, the data says 45% of our people have some form of disability or long-term health condition. Twice that than the rest of the Australian population. What it doesn't include is a measure on psychosocial disability. So we don't really know. I mean, we could say, I think we could all say pretty confidently that it's pretty hard to get through life as a First Nations person without experiencing psychosocial disability. So, but I think there's some really reforming work happening in that area where there are attempts to develop culturally accessible assessment tools. One other quick example I can remember is, so in a lot of our communities, it's not uncommon to talk about, we talk to our ancestors, or we hear our ancestors speak to us. Now, you say that to the wrong person.
It's hearing voices.
It could be viewed as hearing voices. So there's incidents of that happening, definitely. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
No, thank you, Commissioners. As a last question before we move on from child protection to the criminal justice system, already we've traversed quite a significant area of the gaps associated with services for First Nations people with disabilities, particularly focused on child protection. But are there any other reforms to the child protection system that you haven't mentioned that you'd like to tell the Commissioners about?
I think we need our fair access to the early intervention parts of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So the National Disability Insurance Scheme prioritises early intervention. We're not seeing enough young First Nations people with disability getting access to that part of the scheme. And one of the things we want to see reforms urgently is that. So all the evidence shows that the earlier you can provide support to young person with disability, a different life trajectory they have. But all of these things have to be done in partnership with community in a culturally safe way. The overreaction on the part of government will be, I could almost imagine this would be happening where suddenly big disability service providers suddenly get funded to go into town and, start providing services and whatnot, is not the outcome we're looking for. It's about us owning the service side of it. But unfortunately, we don't have a strong history in providing disability services. If we were talking about Aboriginal health, different story, obviously. But there's not many Aboriginal people that have a professional background in disability. That's not a failing, that's just the reality of a dominant health focus. But again, we don't want to. We've got ways of working that should be valued and acknowledged. We've also got plenty of community members that, by any other definition, are support workers already. So we've almost got things in place, but we just need to get our fair share to the NDIS. Be a good start.
Well, I can only imagine if you mentioned a statistic to Commissioner Bell, around 45% of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders suffering from some form of disability. For every one of those people, there's probably a carer involved as well.
Absolutely.
And that might be mob, that might be family, that's more likely for Aboriginal communities. I assume you'd agree with that.
No question. And there has been a real blockage, and we'll be raising this in this new advisory council. The National Disability Insurance Scheme won't allow family members to be paid carers, so that's not going to work. So not only is that wrong and a failing, but because that's a derivative of a purist disability rights agenda, which says there should be separation between service provision and the person with disability. That's a different model altogether. That's not the model we're talking about. That's entirely appropriate that family members be the carers or support people. In fact, they already are. But their ability to access some income or resources through that is really important. Plus, culturally, it's the only way we do business anyway. So, I mean, there's particular interpersonal relations that are, that are cultural. So that's a way of supporting that. But that's another failing of this National Disability Insurance Scheme in recognising that.
Moving then to the criminal justice system and your evidence in your statement regarding that system and its interaction with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders with disabilities. It's interesting that when you describe the link between disability and interaction with the criminal justice system, you focus on young people and engagement at school and a lack of diagnosis often for young people with disability. Could you just take the commissioners through why you focused on that when you really see a link between disability and the criminal justice system?
Yeah, sure. So at the First Peoples Disability Network, through our major piece of research called Culture is Inclusion, that was written by Dr. Scott Avery, who's a Warramai man also, who has hearing impairment. We identified this life trajectory where young Aboriginal person with disability, often undiagnosed, might be arcing up in the classroom or just as equally be very quiet and not noticed, then starts getting suspended or expelled from school, might start hanging around the local shops, copper might start saying, move on, then they're into juvenile detention, again, possibly don't have a diagnosis of disability, probably unlikely to have a diagnosis of disability. In the juvenile detention system, get no support for their disability because effectively they're, a detainee or a prisoner. So you're not a person with disability in there, you're a prisoner effectively. Then, trajectory into adult prison, very common experience. There's a number of disabilities that come up in that context, maybe cognitive impairment, perhaps borderline, this is not language I like to use, but borderline intellectual disability perhaps, where you maybe don't get noticed so much, or hearing impairment is very common. So with hearing impairment, you can get, so sometimes the authorities might view you as not being compliant, when it could be that you just don't hear properly. Or psychosocial disability, so significant anxiety, whatever it might be. But whatever's happened, very unlikely to have a diagnosis. So you're then probably feeling comfortable in your own community, probably well supported in that environment. But when you go to school, we call it, we've called it the bad black kid syndrome, actually, at the First Peoples Disability Network. So the low expectations. So another bad black kid mucking up, you know. Whereas we would then meet that family and go, well, hang on, is he hearing all right, or is he getting enough sleep or whatever, or what's going on, or is he come from poverty where he's just not getting opportunity like other people do? Again, not failings of the community and not failings of the family, the failings of the system to recognise the context. That's a very common story. So we did a lot of work with the Koori Court. Again, I'm referencing Parramatta in Sydney, but the magistrate asked us to come out there because she was saying on hearing days she reckoned that every Aboriginal young person appearing before her had a cognitive impairment or some form of disability. And we would say absolutely that was true. So, but then when they go into juvenile detention, they're very vulnerable to abuse and even manipulation sometimes. So it's also not uncommon for people with cognitive impairment, even fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or some types of disability, to have a real desire to want to be compliant, or I think that's the right word, but there's a lot of evidence to show that even in police interview situations, people can be coerced sometimes. There's some grey areas there that are always of concern, I think.
And you mention once people enter into the criminal justice system, there's a lack of disability support. Do you know what types of support are available for Aboriginal people who might have a disability in prison?
I'd say they're non-existent, so including here in Victoria largely. There are forensic support units which deal very specifically with people with very significant mental health, very serious mental illness. They're the people that, including Aboriginal people who, by the court system, are viewed to either be a harm to themselves or a harm to others. So they have very significant psychosocial disability, very significant mental illness. There are forensic support units that can provide support in that instance. But for people that have a cognitive impairment, when I say the forensic support units, I'm not necessarily being a flag waver and saying that they're a good system either. But if you have cognitive impairment, essentially what disability services relate to in prison are things like sedation, chemical restraint, isolation, even forms of solitary confinement. Not used, that term's not used so much, but versions of it. I'd describe that as the way the system addresses disability, which is punitive. It's effectively criminalising disability. And we have a growing problem in Australia. Not only do we know that we have increasing population of First Nations people across the country, but we also have an increasing population of people with disability in Australian prisons. Because, for a whole host of reasons, but when you can't get access to meaningful mental health supports, and if your behaviour deteriorates, if it happens in regional remote Australia, it's particularly acute, you better make sure you have your psychotic episode on the third Tuesday of every fourth month when the mental health team's in town, or you're in the back of a paddy wagon. So that's what happens a lot, including here in Victoria, where our people with significant psychosocial disability end up in the back of paddy wagons. So they're criminalised. And I think one of the big failings we have, again, across the country, which to me is still a mystery and I can't describe it any other way than thinking it's weird, but police, most of their interactions would be with people that have very significant psychosocial disability. In fact, most of their workload would be, or domestic violence situations, yet there really isn't meaningful training. You need a lot of, you need good training to understand how to work with people that are in the middle of an episode, say, or how to de-escalate, or you need to understand those things. I think police sometimes are in a terrible position because they're not trained in these things, and their first reaction will be to take a punitive action, which will then likely escalate. So if you're a person with paranoid schizophrenia, often what you're paranoid about is authority. So it's quite common for people with serious mental illness like that to be fearful of police, for example. It's almost so the de-escalation will be rapid, and that's a failing. And this is a failing of mental health services more generally. So particularly in regional Australia. So, but not exclusively. It happens in our capital cities too. But these are the consequences of those lack of supports.
And I assume there's a compounding effect from a number of the issues we've discussed.
Yeah.
A lack of diagnosis based on a lack of culturally appropriate assessment tools.
Yeah.
In order to access systems, even if there is access to those systems, they're culturally unsafe, so there's a community in which you have certain behaviours that play out that are then criminalised rather than treated, and once you overlay issues of poverty and those types of things, you've got overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the criminal justice system anyway. All of those things, I assume, can compound and are particularly significant for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders with disabilities.
Absolutely, and I think this is an urgent problem that needs some good thinking to address, and I think it's for us to think about the solutions, and the system's failed miserably and continuing to. We've got good ideas about how to support our own community members. There's always been psychosocial disability. It's not a new phenomenon necessarily, but we had ways of supporting community members that was entirely appropriate. So we need to get back to owning the responses to it. You know, we've got the solutions always. The system doesn't have the answers.
Well, you've preempted my next question. What are those solutions? What would you like to see as the reforms in criminal justice, particularly for First Nations people with disabilities?
Yeah, I think one of the first fairly easy fixes is to co-locate disability advocates with Aboriginal legal services. So the Aboriginal lawyers that we spend time talking to are overwhelmed doing the lawyering. You know, that's a big job that they have to do that every day. What they lack sometimes is someone that has an understanding of disability to do the other things that they can't get to. My understanding of the pressures on some of the Aboriginal lawyers are just phenomenal. Like their client may be homeless, their client may be whatever it might be. So we need to co-locate disability advocates with Aboriginal legal services. I think that's a fairly easy fix relatively quickly. We also need a version of a custody notification service that recognises disability as a factor. So there's been good trials, I'm not so familiar with Victoria, but there's been good trials of custody notification services in New South Wales where Arnie might get a call to say there's someone down here tonight at the cop shop, can you come down and help out? We need a disability element to that, a mental health element to that. I think that's urgently needed. The amount of people with Well, there's some research now out of the University of New South Wales that says that something like 70 to 80% of Aboriginal prisoners have a cognitive impairment. Or if you talk to some legal practitioners, they'll say every one of my clients has some form of disability, mild, moderate, extreme, it doesn't matter. So we have to recognise that there needs to be something built into the system that provides protections to those people. If you're someone who's having a psychotic episode, well, any Aboriginal person dealing with police, there's going to be an element of fear and of the power of the police. If you add another dimension of serious mental illness, then the situation can deteriorate so rapidly. And these are the untold stories. Sometimes the untold stories of some of our deaths in custody, we would say, is that there's a disability component to it, big time.
Commissioners, those were my questions. Invite the commissioners to ask any questions they might want to ask.
I do like the idea of that you're talking about the co-location of disability advocates with legal services. So that is something, of course, that the state could fund.
Yeah.
And it should not only support First Peoples better, but actually support services and mean the police and others don't have to get involved in
Yes.
unnecessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a simple idea, really. It's a very simple idea, really, that once the lawyering bit's done, go down the corridor and have a yarn with this person here, and they might be able to assist you with your homeless situation or get you on the DSP or whatever. It could be anything. I think that's a relatively easy fix, and I don't know that we'd be talking about a massive investment necessarily, but I think co-locating in our organisations, though, is the critical part, So.
Thank you.
From accountability or a governance and oversight perspective, thinking about Victoria, there's not much going on in the sense. I mean, you're just doing proactive work here. What are your sort of thoughts on whether reform opportunities are there?
So we need to really, so there's a number of Aboriginal people with disability down here in Victoria, as you would know, who are leaders, but we need to give them the resources to build an organisation around them. So, tomorrow, it could be established tomorrow, to be honest. And I think that's some of the frustration that some leaders from down here have had, is that they haven't had the opportunity to build their own voice. There's some very strong leaders down here. I think a pretty quick investment to build the Aboriginal Disability Network Victoria, or whatever it wants to be, where they can then have a seat at the table with all the different meetings that go on. We find at the First Peoples Disability Network that if we aren't at the table, disability doesn't get talked about. Like, it's one of those issues, that's sort of very, still even in Australian society generally. Mind you, there's been a big shift. It's definitely more talk of disability, no question, but it's still an issue that doesn't get enough attention. So people like Uncle John Baxter, other prominent leaders from down here, they'd start up their organisation tomorrow, I'd be confident. There's some great stuff that's happened at Thornbury, and there's some really good local initiatives. Baddock does some great stuff. So there's people around. They just need the commitment to give them some, we're happy to help out anyway, but I'd be really confident people will do that perfectly well themselves. So, yeah.
What kind of authority do you think that they need?
A formal organisation.
Authority in the context of government accountability.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it needs to have formal status. So the best example I can give you, Commissioner, is the way we're going to start making change with the NDIS is if we have authority where we're straight to the board. We don't want to be just little advisory council, you know what I'm saying, where you sort of meet a couple of times a year and say the same thing you said last year. We actually need direct lines into power. So in Victoria to be, the secretary of the department knows that this group's going and it meets regularly. I think we've all been frustrated by those things over many years, Like we know how these committee things work better than anyone, So if we can have formal structures that go straight up into leadership, then that's the way to go.
Yeah, and the reason why I asked that, because you referred earlier to strategic governance forum being set up between yourself being co-chair with the CEO of the NDIS. So It's just more what does that look like, and also how would you enhance that?
Yeah, so that's taken a long time to get to that place. It's probably because there's a bit more of a reforming agenda there, so that's helpful. But we've demanded it really until it's not fair income any other way. So we all know what it's like to be, take your place there sort of thing. But we just demanded that it has to be, and it probably goes in line with the gradual change that seems to be starting to happen. We're seeing, again, I'm talking about the Commonwealth level, there's been a bit of a shift. We have more partnership relationships with some agencies, others are so far behind it's not funny. But again, things like the Commission here are just so vital, I think, for setting a model. I think sometimes the bureaucracy thinks this stuff way too hard or something. I don't know what it is, but the power of commissions like this, I think, set the scene. Certainly in my home state, we're going to need this, but we might be some way off. But I think this shows partnership, and that's really important, eh?
Yeah, because the government, has publicly committed quite strongly to self-determination here, which is a very different conversation to inclusion in a sense as well. So I think just thinking about, what you've shared with us today, but also, what does a self-determining model look like?
That's a great, self-determination has to be the aim. Inclusion's not enough, eh? Inclusion can be different things to different people too, eh? Like, we invited you. So we included you, but whether we actually allowed self-determination. It's interesting, self-determination is also the language of people with disability. So there's opportunities there for crossover. So in the international disability rights movement, the catchphrase is nothing about us without us, which is kind of cool, it's a good one. So that is a principle of disability rights too. So there's some nice opportunities for crossover there actually. So
thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Just off the back of Commissioner Lovett's questions there, is there frameworks or strategies with accountability processes in place across the disability sort of within government, specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander?
No, not really, and that's one of the things we're looking to change. So Closing the Gap has identified disability as a priority area, so that's a move forward. That's a step forward, but not to a level where a lot of the other targets are. So our frustration is we need to now elevate that into a standalone issue under Closing the Gap, for example. In a Commonwealth, and then it happens in the States too. So at a Commonwealth level, our frustration has been, we've just been a paragraph in each, right? So you're a paragraph in the Australian Disability Strategy and you're a paragraph in Closing the Gap, but you're kind of neither in either, you know what I mean? So we need to develop our own strategy. In Victoria, there's really robust structures around disability. In a lot of ways, Victoria is sort of, from a disability rights perspective, is the heartbeat of where disability rights is in Australia, really. So a lot of the national peaks, a lot of the old self-advocacy organisations, most of them come out of Victoria. So there's a strong culture of that here, but what is lacking is the Aboriginal component. So a lot of the leaders down here have to join in with, you know what I'm trying to say? And I think their frustration is that, well, no, we've got a whole lot of unique things we want to talk about, culturally accessible, culturally appropriate services or culturally appropriate assessment tools, So that's why there needs to be, a network resource down here. And again, probably been having those conversations for a decade or more, to be honest, with DHHS. Comfortably for more than a decade. There's highly capable leaders down here, so what's the delay, So
Just with, you were speaking about police and disability, I just wanted to get your view on particularly mental health issues, which you spoke about, and the CAT team.
The CAT team is the assessment.
Crisis assessment.
Yeah.
It's sent out sometimes, but with police sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's. I think the whole area of mental health, particularly in regional Australia, is very fraught. So there's a lack of services in general, plus people only get support at crisis anyway. So you generally have to do something very, very serious to be even supported. So there's plenty of examples of, including our mob with significant psychosocial disability, even presenting at hospitals, for example, and saying, hey, I'm really not well. I'm really not well. I'm doing the right thing, actually. I'm coming to you saying I'm not well, I'm not travelling well, and then they get turned away. And then some tragic things can happen. I think mental health is in such a crisis. I mean, everyone talks about how much of a crisis it's in, so it's not news to anyone, but I don't think we see any really meaningful change. So one of the really good programs that disappeared was there was this Aboriginal mental health first aid program, which was a really simple idea where you train up local community members how to how to provide support to your other community members when they're not travelling.
It's still around.
It
It
is.
depends on the organisation who implements it. So it is.
Nice.
Yeah, it is still around. It's a good program.
It's got to keep that needs to be rolled out across the country, to be honest. So, because the value of that is you're hopefully supporting people before crisis, and you're keeping the response within community that way too. So you're hopefully going to avoid the involvement of police because you're learning how to support your own community member with their mental health needs.
Yep.
I think there needs to be more investment in those kind of things, definitely.
In saying that, you spoke to Commissioner Walter's point before about disability advocates, and you spoke about it in legal setting. What about in all settings, in all Aboriginal organisations that they have disability-specific workers to work with?
Commissioner, that would be where we want to get to.
Yeah. And one last thing, I just wanted to ask, and you didn't mention it, but the Association of Disability and Homelessness, I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, common. So most, as you know, most people that are homeless have psychosocial disability. So no different in our communities. So yeah, there's a clear correlation there, and again, that's a failing of the system. So yeah, I think that's an area that we don't well understand either. So the general comment I'd make is that the lack of data in this area is really kind of a worry. So to me, it's indicative of how out of mind and how out of sight this issue is of disability in our communities. But we're just got to own the data, eh? Like we've got to. I get nervous about saying that because I immediately go to, and maybe I'm being too pessimistic, but I immediately go to weird and wonderful eugenics stuff. That's where my mind goes to. So as long as we're collecting it the way we know how to talk about disability, plus we'll get what we need because of the trust. Yeah. Whereas if someone comes in with a pen in their top pocket, it ain't
I'll just
gonna
make a quick point there. This might be an opportunity for pressure because I know that NIAA are currently looking at developing measures for close the gap targets because you put all the targets in and then they found they didn't have any of the data to actually report on them. So this might be a sort of a good spot where that talk about proper First Nations designed measurements to be included in those.
And disability is quite measurable. So the school one's a good example, I think, of... there's always a reason behind it's either the child doesn't feel safe in the school or their disability is not accommodated or it's culturally unsafe or whatever, but there's always a reason. So they're measurable things about... there are parts of disability that are easily measurable, actually, I think.
I think that is all for me. Oh, just a comment. I really like to comment about how you talk about how disability is sort of a one paragraph. You know, I feel like being Aboriginal, you get the one paragraph and then you get the next paragraph with the disability and being Aboriginal. So it's like this add-on.
That's it.
Which I feel you're, just a bit of commentary there.
I think there's more and more of this othering going on.
Yeah.
You know, there's just it's usually First Nations people call disability. A few other groups, you know, it's over in... Yeah. It's the othering.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. In relation to effective advocacy, there is a strong lived experience movement in Victoria,
Yes.
of which you'll be aware, among people with lived experience of mental illness. Have you been able to tap into that as a way of increasing your power of advocacy?
We will do more of that. We've had some discussions with those groups, and you're absolutely right. Victoria does have that strong self-advocacy history. And also the movement of, including people with cognitive impairment, is very strong in Victoria too. So probably had more relationships with people like Valid, that organisation Valid, which is very much focused on intellectual disability. But lived experience of psychosocial disability, we need to do more in that area, definitely.
Now, if you go down that approach, the question immediately becomes, what is the lived experience? And I think you seem to be saying that the lived experience of being of Aboriginal community and having a disability needs to be recognised as a thing in itself.
No question.
Could you expand on that just briefly?
Yeah, so it's because our people with disability would say they are First Nations people first, but they are people with disability also. So where they find frustration, if I can speak on their behalf, is that it's that they need to have their voice heard in both movements. So, or the other example I can give that's bigger picture, one of the challenges we face at the First Peoples Disability Network is we have to be a loud voice in the disability sector, and we also have to be a loud voice in the Indigenous rights world. So that's very onerous. So it's the same at a micro level for a person, First Nations person with disability. So they want to be, speaking up in the cerebral palsy sector, but they also want to be able to go to their land council and say, hey, I want to come to land council meetings. So it is really critical that it has its own focus, no doubt. And for also those reasons about, if we want to talk disadvantage, then we're talking serious disadvantage here. So, but the system is still really confounded by the term. I don't necessarily like the term, but it's the term intersectional discrimination. So systems don't know what to do with that. So we grew out of the disability rights movement because we were funded that way. Because there's no one that would know how to fund something that cuts off in two areas. You get my drift? So
I do. It's
still a huge problem, that, I think.
Now, you, if I understand you correctly, you seem to be saying that there is widespread non-observance of human rights in systems relating to people with disability as regards Aboriginal people and indeed generally. Do I understand that to be?
No question.
No question.
But disproportionately impacting on our mob with disability. So
Yep.
at the extreme end of human rights violations in Australia and the kind of things we've taken to the United Nations, we talk about, so we have indefinite detention of Aboriginal people with disability in Australian prisons. Not aware of a case in Victoria, but be interested to see how you measure that.
Yeah.
Like in my home state, there's several Aboriginal women with significant disability who are in prison much longer than they should be if they'd pled guilty to that. So I'd imagine there's scenarios like that in Victoria. I can't say that for sure, but we would call that indefinite detention. So, and if you stop and think about that, if we stop and think about that, that's an extraordinary violation of someone's human rights. So that happens in Australia, and it happens mostly to Aboriginal people.
You've described situations where families are too fearful to disclose that their children may have a disability because of the attention that might attract in the authorities. Another way of expressing that is that it's a discrimination, indeed a very gross discrimination.
No question.
And human rights involve a duty to prevent that from happening. What would you say about the degree of knowledge among systems such as the child welfare system and other systems that have the capacity to impact on human rights, of the knowledge of human rights?
I'd say very, very poor, to be honest with you, Commissioner. I think that point is exactly right. So we're talking about a system that actively discriminates. So it discriminates on the basis of, so it's institutional racism,
Yeah,
and it's also institutional ableism.
yeah.
Institutional ableism doesn't get talked about as much, but institutional ableism is a growing movement, I think, globally. So you could say, for example, Melbourne, parts of Melbourne, certainly parts of Sydney, are inaccessible to people that have physical disability, right? So, and that's just a fact. So you could make a case to say that so some disability advocates would describe that as a form of apartheid, because what they say is that you are creating spaces that I can't access. So you're creating a form of keeping me apart. So, and I would agree with that, actually. So again, I refer to my home city, Sydney. So Redfern train station, where our office was for many years, one of the busiest train stations in Sydney, one accessible train platform. And you had to make sure you came from the eastern suburbs. That's the only accessible train line, right? So very busy train station, services Sydney University. In my 20 years there, never saw a wheelchair user get out of that train station. So, yeah, so that's institutional ableism. So we've still got a very long way to go, you know?
Yeah.
Very long way to go.
Looking at it from the other perspective, which is the consumer perspective, if I can put it that way, is there awareness of the rights that they possess?
No, not enough. And one of our training programs, which we would love to see better investment of, and what the network here in Victoria could do is deliver the training that they could make their own version of it. But our training, which we call the Lester Bostock Human Rights Training Program, which is about educating our own community about disability rights. So a lot of our families aren't aware that the education system is supposed to accommodate the disability of your child. That's a very grey area, though, because it comes down to if you've got a good principle or not, really, to be honest. But anyway, so we definitely need to educate our own community members definitely about disability rights. It's a real weakness. Not a lot of people know about their rights. But no, they can't build. The building shouldn't have steps there. You should be able to get into it. Simple things like that. But that'd be the kind of thing the local network could do. You know, like you have people with disability themselves doing the training. Yeah. It's powerful, you know, it's pretty powerful.
Lawyers were co-located with services.
Yeah.
Then they could take legal action if that was possible.
Even better, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Got one more? This is about economic empowerment. What about employment opportunities, for our mob? Can you just sort of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Or I should say economic disempowerment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't, it's very uncommon in my experience or at the First Peoples Disability Network experience for a First Nations person with disability to be in employment. So every one of our board members is a First Nations person with disability, and I can't report, even though each and every one of them are highly capable leaders, all of them have had problems getting a job, maintaining a job. Most of our staff have some form of disability, which is great, but the Australia, as you would know, Commissioner, I'm sure, is one of the worst employers of people with disability in the OECD. So for our mob, so Australia does really poorly on employing people with disability, and for our community, it's very uncommon to find one of our community members with disability to be in employment. I qualify that a little bit though and say that it's not they're not valued in their own community though. It's when they go outside, that's when the problem starts. But there needs to be a strategy on that in its own right, because people with disability have much to offer, So yeah, that's a real problem, big problem. Needs its own thinking, its own strategy. But yeah, it's not something that happens really. Sad. Yeah, it's not good.
Do you know of anywhere in the world that's doing relatively okay at that?
I think in the UK they go okay. Scandinavia definitely. Scandinavia big time. And as you would know, Commissioner, the Indigenous rights movement in Scandinavia is strong, and they've got their own mechanisms there. So I think that's where you'd see best practice, no problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
And maybe just a comment that Europe is highly regulated, not just from a discrimination point of view, but a proactive employment point of view,
Yeah, right. Yep.
with wholly different outcomes to here.
Yep. Nice.
No, Damien, is there anything else that you wanted to tell the commissioners before we finish with your evidence?
No, just that you know, that the point we were making at the beginning, that we're all talking about, that you know, we are the thought leaders on inclusion. You know, we've always had a way, and I think if, like a lot of things, we've got a lot of expertise, and the rest of the world needs to catch up sometimes, I think. So that's the only point I'd want to make, I guess.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks.
That
Thank you.
concludes the evidence.
So we're adjourning until the morning.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming today.
Oh, thanks.
Damien?
Thank you, brother.